Hello everyone, my name is Minko Gechev. I'm working on Angular at Google. Today in this presentation I would want to share with you what is the current state of Angular. So we're going to cover pretty much two main topics. First, we're going to focus on one of, well, in my opinion, the greatest strengths of the framework, and right after that we're going to look at where we are right now and where we're going in terms of development of new features and processes. So while I was working on this presentation, I noticed that it was spinning around a common topic, which was pretty much around our shared and core values of the team. Generally, we're working on a framework that aims to enable developers to build applications that make their users happy. At the same time, we're investing a lot in development experience so that we can enable Angular as a framework that puts developer in a position Hello everyone, my name is Minko Gechev. I'm working on Angular at Google. Today in this presentation I would want to share with you what is the current state of Angular. Pretty much we're going to cover two main topics. First, we're going to start with one of the, in my opinion, greatest strength of Angular, which is its feature to be evergreen. And right after that, we're going to focus on where we are right now and where are we going in the future. So let us get started. While I was preparing this talk, I noticed that everything was spinning around three core values, which are in fact the core values that our team has. First, we want to make Angular in a way that developers can build apps that users love to use. Right after that, we want to focus on development experience so that we can enable developers to build applications that, well, they enjoy the process of building. And last but not least, of course, we want to build a very inclusive community where everyone feels welcome. We're doing our best to make advancements in all of these three different spaces, and I would want to share a couple of things with you that we have been working on. But first, let me focus on the strength, the unique strength of the framework that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. According to many folks, the core strengths of the framework are that it's opinionated, so that you're following best practices from the beginning. In fact, we embedded deeply the best practices that we discovered across looking at thousands of applications and talking to many thousands of developers. We enabled them in the framework itself and also in our tooling. We're also trying to make the entire experience of building applications scalable. Not only scalable in terms of how many lines of code your application is going to be like, but also how large your team is and how you can reuse best practices across individual projects. The unique feature that we're going to cover today is the evergreenness of Angular. But before that, I also want to mention, of course, the fantastic ecosystem that we're in. This ecosystem is providing so many great modules and libraries that small projects as well as large enterprises are stepping on top, and they're enabling them to build delightful user experiences. So the evergreenness. In order to illustrate why I think this is a unique strength for our platform, I would want to share a couple of details with you on where Angular is right now inside of Google. One thing I learned after joining Google was that the only constant was actually change. I went through many reorganizations because Google in general is trying to constantly optimize their activities. They're trying to constantly optimize their delivery pipeline and make the collaboration within the individual organizations as smooth as possible. I went through so many reorgs that at a certain point I opened my fridge in San Francisco and I saw this candy. This was given to us in celebration for the new organizations that we are part of. And well, I didn't eat this candy until the moment when this organization was no longer existing and we moved to a separate one. So this happened probably in a matter of, like, let's say a month or two. The changes that are happening are that rapid. Originally, actually, Angular started under apps because we have more product-based organizational structure where the individual product areas had their own infrastructure teams. But currently, we are in a slightly different place. Since Angular generally aims to provide infrastructure for the development of web applications. We provide several different products that developers can empower so that they can build delightful user experiences. So currently we're in a more functional structure. There is a place in the organization called Core Systems where you can find Angular and also a bunch of other infrastructural teams. This enables us to do a lot of collaboration. So we're often talking to teams such as TensorFlow. We're, for example, brainstorming how we can enable predictive prefetching by using more accurate models compared to the Markov chains that tools like Guess.js provide nowadays. We are in constant collaboration with Firebase. I talked to Flutter once in a while in order to brainstorm how we can improve the development experience in general of the technologies that we provide. Under Core Systems, there are different sub-teams. We have Foundations, which are the TypeScript.js team, Build and Serve, many others. And also we have Frameworks, where we have Angular and Wiz, which are two of the leading frameworks inside of Google right now. In fact, originally, since Angular introduced the TypeScript language inside of Google, the TypeScript team was part of Angular itself. After the organizations that happened later on, and because of the growth of TypeScript within Google, the TypeScript team moved to a the TypeScript portion of the Angular team moves to a separate team, which was entirely focused on maintaining the TypeScript language within the organization. So now we're going to the evergreenness part. Generally, something that is, I would say, unique to Angular, to Google, and probably it's also a practice in other organizations, but well, Google is the first place where I saw it, is that Angular supports all the projects that are using it. This means that our team is responsible for making sure that many projects within Google are functioning properly with the latest changes that we have introduced into the framework. Let me go back a couple of years. On the 14th of September 2016, Angular was released. I clearly remember this event. Back then, I wasn't part of the Angular team, but this happened about, let's say, 2 weeks after I moved to California, to the Bay Area from Bulgaria. And I was very actively contributing to the framework. I wrote a book about it. I was collaborating with different team members. And generally, I was really excited about this product. So I remember staying there in the hall full of Angular team members, many other attendees, and also a lot of Angular balloons around. And I was really excited to see that what I've been working on, like my book, is finally going to be relevant, and many people are going to start reading it thanks to the official release of the framework. So this happened about 4 years ago, right? We celebrated the 4th year anniversary of Angular a couple of weeks ago. Since then, we have over 2,600 Angular projects within Google. Their size varies, of course. We have many small applications, such applications, for example, of like the menus of internal cafeterias, to huge, enormous applications, such as Google Cloud Console, which has millions of lines of code. In fact, some of our internal tooling, such as our bug management system and also our review system, they are created with Angular itself. This is a growth like almost twice as many compared to 2019. And at the same time, we have hundreds of thousands of TypeScript files. Not all of them are associated with Angular projects, but I would say that the majority of them are. And now remember, we need to make sure that all these projects are functioning with Angular. If we break Angular, we need to go there and fix all these projects. I want to particularly focus on this because, in my opinion, this is a huge advantage. I know it may sound like we are going to push changes slower this way, but well, we're going to push changes in a way that we're much more sure that they're bringing value to everyone and that they have very smooth migration path. So let me share a couple of words with you on how are we achieving this. Before going into this, I would want to mention a word or two about our internal source code organization. Generally, Google maintains all these projects within a single monorepo. When I joined the Angular team, one of my first roles was to look into Bezo and how we can leverage it in the open source ecosystem. Bezo is the build system that empowers this huge growth of our monorepo, that enables incremental builds across of it, and also that ensures that we're also building the smallest amount of targets that are affected by certain change. But there are quite a few benefits that we're getting out of this monorepo. We are, for example, sharing a lot of knowledge. It is much easier to reuse source code this way. We reuse infrastructure by having only a single build system and a single CI and much more. But the benefits for Angular out of this organization are that we have an enormous test coverage. Really, every change we make, if it breaks something, we're going to know about it. So that enormous code coverage is much more powerful than having 100% end-to-end test coverage or even unit test coverage, since there are many other variables around that. For example, we have, let's say, temporal coupling across different structures and so on and so forth. And it is really not obvious to test all these things. But having 2,600 projects inside of Google lets us know exactly what is happening and exactly what is the impact of the changes that we're doing. At the same time, there are, as I mentioned, quite a few projects out there using Angular. We want to be able still to innovate, although we want to be able to innovate with steady steps by pushing incremental changes. At the same time, we want to break stuff, right? Because that's what enables innovation. When we break something, we're going to fix it for everyone just by running out a migration across all these hundreds of projects within the monorepo. These migration scripts are really well tested since they're running over, as I mentioned, hundreds of thousands of TypeScript files and also a lot of template files as well. At the same time, looking at all of these 2,600 projects, everyone has access to them. Everyone can look inside of their source code and we can explore on different patterns how they're using Angular so that we can define our style guides and embed it really well within our tooling infrastructure. Pretty much probably the greatest benefit that the external ecosystem is getting out of this is not only the opinionation but the update experience. This is what makes Angular evergreen, thanks to these migration scripts that we're getting for free by maintaining all the stability within Google. And in fact, this is something pretty unique to the framework. I have talked to some friends of mine who are working on the Linux kernel, and I would assure you that things are much less predictable there. They're currently working on such global CI called kernelci.org, which is going to enable them to track what impact the individual patches to the Linux kernel have, but it's not just there yet. So that's why they're experiencing breakages once in a while. Well, that was most of it what I wanted to share about the evergreenness of the framework. I hope that I was able to point out my excitement about why I think this brings so much value to the entire ecosystem. Now let me focus on how are we trying to make Angular successful. Generally, Angular has two main stakeholders: all the developers that we're building the framework for, and also all the users of the web. We are closely collaborating with the Chrome team pretty much on a weekly basis just to ensure that we're providing the best user experiences so that we can make the entire web platform successful together. Often also the requirements of the developers and the users of the web, they're a little bit orthogonal. Sometimes what is good for developers in terms of development experience kind of impacts the user experience of end users, so we are usually quite careful when we are making prioritization decisions. Also because at the same time we have quite a few developers out there. Only the Angular language service has over 1,700,000 downloads. So you can imagine that we're getting a lot of issues in terms of issues on GitHub, a lot of customer feature requests from different conversations on external events. We're running a lot of surveys. Of course, clearly we have some technical depth, right? The Angular platform has pretty large public API surface, and over time we need to innovate, we need to refactor stuff, we need to break things. So the technical depth is constantly a large portion of that. We received a lot of feedback from our Google developer experts, interviews, and so on and so forth. So it's really hard to prioritize stuff, you can imagine, right? Usually when we're trying to prioritize a feature, we're looking at our core values. We're trying to figure out whether this feature is going to make the users of the web happier while taking advantage of different web experiences. We're evaluating whether we can implement this feature in a developer ergonomic way. And finally, we're thinking about how we can make it in a way that everyone can join and be part of this process. So I'm going to talk about all these three things more in the next couple of slides, and the improvements that we in fact did over the past couple of months. So when we find an intersection across our three values for a particular feature, this means that it is an excellent fit for us so that we can prioritize it in our roadmap. You know that earlier this year we released version 9, and that was the biggest release that we did for Angular after we pushed Angular on the 14th of September 2016. Ivy was pretty much a rewrite of the entire framework and the compiler, but at the same time we leveraged what we have internally inside of Google. We leveraged this internal monorepo to ensure that the migration path for everyone is as straightforward as possible. We released a couple of migrations that moved changes in the public APIs of Angular to the latest version. But at the same time, as you can imagine, this wasn't a trivial change. We spent probably more time than we should have on rolling it out. That is why currently we're in a state of a lot of bug fixes, a lot of issue triage, and performance improvements. One of the biggest efforts that we are currently occupied with is the bylog effort. Bylog is a project where we're spending up to 50% of our engineering time in triaging issues on GitHub. So far, we triaged hundreds of issues across our three monorepos. We reduced the number of issues on the CLI with 30%, and we have fewer than, I would say, even like 10 issues that are untriaged under components. At the same time, we're able to see what are the highest priorities, and we were able to understand better what developers needed from the framework. So this is how we started fixing some of the most highly voted bugs and feature requests. For instance, we did a lot of improvements here in the router. We did a lot of improvements in forms. But at the same time, we also shipped the third most highly voted issue on Angular, and it is related to internationalization. As part of version 9, we shipped an entire new internationalization pipeline, which was backward compatible with what we had before. But it enabled much faster builds, since we were no longer compiling the individual projects for each separate language. Instead, we provide only a single build, and right after that we perform just individual string replacements. The internationalization pipeline of Angular is very much focused on how it can enable developers to build web applications that users love to use. We made some trade-offs there, which are somehow impacting development experience, but at the same time, they're providing zero runtime overhead mechanism for translating your websites, which makes the experience of using this website really fast. This enables smaller bundles, and also the applications are much faster to load and change them. At the same time, each change of the language may require eventually a page refresh, but we rely on the fact that people were usually not changing the language of their page far too frequently. There are so much more about internationalization, but the feature that we actually handled and fixed as part of our bylog effort was to add translations outside of Angular templates, and also load translations at runtime. You can learn more about this effort in the Angular localization with Ivy post by Pete Bacon-Darwin from the Angular framework team. Something that I've never heard of is that developers' builds are fast enough, right? As part of our build pipeline, we provide a lot of compile time optimizations, and also we ensure that you have fewer defects so that we perform type checking in both templates and the TypeScript code. But at the same time, this is bringing certain overhead. This build system is impacting the development experience, so clearly we would always want to have build time overhead, right? So we focus on making our compilation pipeline faster. In fact, one of the major efforts that we shipped right now as part of a minor release was to make NGCC 2 to 4 times faster. At the same time, we did a couple of other profiling efforts in the Angular compiler, and we dug deeper so that we went even to the TypeScript compiler as well. So Joost from the Angular compiler team, he made a performance improvement in TypeScript itself so that we can leverage faster builds for the entire ecosystem, not only Angular, but also any other consumer of TypeScript. We're expecting this change to roll out in version 4.1, but until then, we have a couple of other improvements on the pipeline that are going to improve your build times in the next release. Hot module reloading was another feature request that we were pretty much frequently getting from developers. We were supporting hot module reloading thanks to the Webpack dev server, but the configuration wasn't really straightforward. What the Angular CLI team did was to enable developers to use it with just a single HMR flag, so now anyone can take advantage of it. And there is so much more that we're planning to roll out as part of version 11. For example, we're going to share an Ivy language service preview. We're planning to ship a Webpack version 5 preview. We will be collaborating very closely with the community on making a migration path from TSLint to ESLint. James Henry has been from extremely valuable support to us in making sure that the migration path is as smooth as possible. And we have clearly many bug fixes and improvements in the meantime, thanks to Operation Bylog. Right, so what's coming up next? So to make experience for end users of your web applications better, we're working on render blocking resource elimination. We're planning to pretty much inline the critical CSS for your web application inside of the index.html file, and from there lazy load the rest so that we can pretty much eliminate all the render blocking styles and also inline font definitions. Based on some very early benchmarks, we noticed that this improves the first contentful paint with over 3.7 seconds. And since Angular is evergreen, you'll be able to take advantage of this feature when we roll it out with just running ng update angular/CLI. We're also focused on a couple of bigger efforts that, well, we don't have exact timeline for just yet, but we will be very vocal about them when we do. First, Webpack 5 is going to enable better support for micro frontends. And this is one of the top features that we have been hearing from that developers want us to enable. We're working on Angular DevTools. This is an effort that I'm going to talk more about in a little bit. To simplify the learning paths for developer, we have been looking into making ng modules optional. This way we're going to reduce the conceptual overhead for people who are just getting started with the framework and make Angular pretty much easier for folks new to web development as well. And finally, probably the biggest out of these efforts is zoneless. Let me just spend a couple of minutes talking about Angular DevTools. You have probably used already Augury. This is a tool that Rango.io developed in close collaboration with the Angular team. Because of the lot domain expertise that the team at Rango has, we joined forces together to develop something like Augury, which allows you to preview your component structure, allows you to edit individual properties of your components and preview the changes. But we also want to enable performance profiling. That is going to allow you to see how much time you're spending in the individual change detection cycles of your application, and also preview which are the components with the slowest change detection or where you can do improvements in their lifecycle hooks. We're still in a very early testing phase of this extension, but we're going to share more details when it gets more production ready. Zoneless is another effort that is going to be pretty impactful for us in the long run. Currently, you can pretty much run Angular applications without zones, right? You can specify the no operation zone when you're bootstrapping your app, and you don't really need the ng zone. You can trigger change detection manually and so on and so forth. And at the same time, we have been what I wanted to say, excuse me, is that the zoneless effort is slightly more than that. At the same time, we have spent a lot of time in optimizing the Angular applications out there. We try to make our change detection as fast as possible. Minko gave an excellent talk on Angular Connect last year, talking about how we're making Angular fast by leveraging all these internal low-level optimizations that the JavaScript virtual machine does. With zoneless, what we want to do there is provide even finer grained control to the change detection of the developer. We want to enable you to run change detection only over the components that you want, whenever you want, and so much more. Whenever we're ready with this effort, we're going to share more details in our public channels so that we can start a discussion together. And finally, I wanted to spend some time talking about some of the changes that we did to build a community where everyone feels welcome. The first step of this effort was our release of the official Angular roadmap, where we can track which efforts are we currently tackling and what is coming up next. We will be updating our roadmap on a quarterly basis, so stay tuned and feel free to check the progress on Angular.io. The second thing we did was to introduce an RFC process for some of the bigger efforts which have public API impact that we have been working on. We already run 2 successful RFCs where we got tons of very positive and very powerful feedback from everyone that joins the discussions. We run an RFC on Ivy library distribution and also on how we can ship elimination of render blocking resources as part of the Angular CLI. There are more RFCs coming up soon. We did a lot of improvements in our internationalization pipeline so that we can enable the fastest possible experience for end users, so that we can enable you to build applications that your users love to use. We also shipped a bunch of improvements in forms, router, and also in our build pipeline in terms of speed and hot module reloading that can enable you to enjoy your job while using the framework. And finally, we worked a lot on transparency and also on building a more inclusive community where everyone can feel welcome and their opinion valued. Well, thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, you can find me on Twitter at mgechev. Thank you. Bye.